Welcome, welcome. So hello and thank you for joining this very important conversation today. And we can all agree, I think, that something's got to give in this conflict, that the death and the destruction are unacceptable. And it's just a terrible, tragic situation. So this conversation today is designed to allow us to begin to understand one another and to really address the core issues of the conflict and to put ourselves in each other's shoes. Um, and even just the idea of conversation, as you all know, is something that faces great opposition. That a lot of people, it seems, are attached to their ideas of right and wrong and fact and fiction. And anyone who dares to even stray from the official narrative is a fool, an idiot, a traitor, or an enemy. And in this climate, we're very fortunate to have found some individuals who are courageous and good-hearted, who are willing to come together from across the so-called political divides and discuss some of those differences and divides. So we're very blessed at the Middle East Peace Civic Forum to have a wonderful core team. We call them our Heart Pod, and our advisory board members and our friends and partners across the globe. So if we go back to the history of the organization, we've been at this for about 2 years. And then we had a whole plan laid out, and then October 7th happened. And we decided it made sense to go back to the drawing board. And what we identified is that it's really essential that we address the core issues of this conflict in a thoughtful and effective way, an honoring way. And we designed this critical conversation series. And of course, we want to have this conversation go out to a large audience. And also, we get to work with artists and visionaries and thought leaders to kind of take forward the message of peace and coexistence and the value of really getting together and discussing these essential issues in a thoughtful and deep way. And as Larry, one of our team members, said at one point, it's better to go deep into a narrow slice of an issue than to cover a lot of issues broadly. So the conversation today, I hope, will really get into some substance. I don't know exactly what our speakers today will bring up as our critical issues, but our commitment, which we share, is that all of us in the Abrahamic family, and indeed the whole of the human family, get to really discover the opportunity of real brotherhood and sisterhood. And so our guests today are Walid Siam and Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen. And we're so grateful that you could be with us today. You're both men of curiosity, of creativity, and of kind and generous heart. And we need people like you to really join us in this quest to find a way to reconcile and live together and coexist. And our facilitator today is Mr. Bill Phillips, who's joining us from Ireland. And Bill is a studious practitioner of neutrality. And I know we can count on him 100% to, not take sides, but to really unearth the human connection that's there between Walid and Yehuda, and indeed of all of us. And so that's what we're standing in today. And I look forward to a really rich conversation. And with that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you to articulate some of the, I don't know if we're calling them ground rules or guidelines for today. Thank you, Bill.
Sure, I will. Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone, and especially Walid and Yehuda. Just to remind you the way I kind of run this type of conversation is to listen to one another, to hear what the other says, and to hear him out. And so, therefore, only one of you normally will speak at one time. If at any time you find that the other is telling you things which makes you rise, makes your feelings very strong, then the thing to do is to notice where in your body you feel it. So forget the name of the feeling and just notice where in your body you feel it, acknowledge it, but don't act it out. And so, in other words, to keep listening. and to come back when it's your turn. Beyond that, I don't think we need much to say because you two are already well versed in this. So I think with that, unless you have any questions, we ought to begin.
All right, wonderful. So do you want to start with a prompt, Bill, or Yehuda, Walid? Is there anything on your mind that you'd like to talk about today?
By the way, I will leave it and to our guests, I think, to decide.
Yes, there are many things to discuss and talk about. We can talk some real politics. We can talk about the situation of narratives and the positioning of each side. So, and we can connect both. I'm comfortable with how Yehuda also wants things to go.
No, I'm good with those topics. I think we can, and maybe, you know what, maybe I'll start with what I was saying before we officially began, this idea of narratives, because I think that's important and might be a good conceptual framework to move forward with. I was saying that I define a narrative as a collection of selectively chosen facts that are organized to tell a story and contextualized within an ideological worldview. And when I say selected facts, I think there are millions of facts when it comes to the last 100 years, let's say, or 104 years of conflict between Jews and Palestinians in this land. And I think that what we both do is we both tend to select the facts that help us tell the story we want to tell. And I think we both tend to ignore the facts that complicate that story. And I think that on both sides, we also have some subgroups, like different tribes, let's say, within our respective societies that might, you know, have slightly different narratives. I would maybe argue that in Israeli society, there are the two most prominent narratives, I'd say, are what we can call the Zionist narrative, and maybe, for lack of a better term, the Judean narrative. And I think that part of what we saw in the year before the war began, with a lot of the protests within Israeli society, was really a conflict between these two groups, the groups that kind of uphold the Zionist narrative and the Judean narrative, kind of vying for dominance within Israeli society. But as I mentioned before we began, you know, in response to Walid's question, I don't think that those contradictions are as antagonistic right now as they were before this war. And the truth is, we might have Hamas to thank for that. I think that what Hamas did on October 7th and the way Israeli society reacted to it, you know, first of all, experienced it, you know, before responding, really made a lot of the divisions that were tearing Israeli society apart feel somewhat petty. But one thing I want to emphasize is that, you know, when we talk about all these narratives, it's important, for me at least, not to think of them in terms of right and wrong, true and false. I think we're both taking true facts. We're both taking true facts, using them as building blocks to construct a story that's a true story. One could create, theoretically, many different stories with the same facts, but we're both using facts that are true for the most part. I think sometimes we do incorporate things that are not true, but I think you find that most of the time when we talk about each other. I think when Israelis talk about Palestinians, we might say things that aren't really true. They're kind of like our fantasy of who Palestinians are, or what motivates Palestinians, and why Palestinians do certain things. And I think the same is true in reverse. I think when Palestinians when Palestinians speak of themselves, I think they're telling the truth. When Palestinians speak about Israeli society or Zionism, I think sometimes there's a same habit that the Israelis have when talking about Palestinians of like superimposing identities and ideologies and motivations that might not be what we're feeling. So I think we're both getting it right when we talk about ourselves. We sometimes both get it wrong when we talk about each other. And for me, the goal of understanding this, and at least how the way it works in my mind, is that ultimately the only way we're going to be able to move forward and transcend the conflict is to construct a bigger narrative that's inclusive enough to encompass both ostensibly rival narratives and to be protagonists together in the same story instead of being the antagonists in each other's stories. Anyway, that's my introduction. You guys can take that in whatever direction.
Yes, Yehuda, thank you for speaking your mind, because I definitely share most of it. Because yes, how you defined what a narrative is, and the whole idea of selective memory, selective facts, it's all to serve the agenda of that is so exclusive and internal to the group itself. And here I'm talking about the two sides here, the Israelis and the Palestinians. And the idea for me, and that was how we started off the record, and I asked you this: how do you think, after 100 years of existing on the land and having this fight over the land, can create a new narrative? Because both of us have bled in this land because of each other, regardless. And some of the blood was shed by our own. So how do you think, first of all, do you think that after 100 years we have shared enough to create that new narrative? And the second question would be, what do you think that new narrative would be?
I would say that the only way, in my mind, to create this new narrative, this more inclusive narrative that transcends the either-or paradigm, is for a critical mass on both sides to be willing to confront the narrative and identity and experiences of the other without fear. And what I mean by fear is not necessarily the fear of physical harm, although that obviously exists on both sides as well. But I think the fear that my narrative will be delegitimized or invalidated if I accept your narrative. That's the fear, I think, that exists very deeply on both sides. And that's why often those who really try to engage with the identities and narratives and experiences of the other are perceived as either weak or treasonous by their own. Because there's this psychological barrier that exists, I think, is very entrenched on both sides, what I would call a principled ignorance. Like in Israeli society, one who is not ignorant of the Palestinian experience is maybe suspected of buying into the propaganda of the other side a little too much, and also vice versa. I think in Palestinian society, those who are really trying to engage with the Jewish story and to understand what the Jews think we're doing here and why we're doing it, etc., is also thought of as, being, at best manipulated, at worst becoming a traitor or a token. And so I think that this principled ignorance is something we have to identify as an enemy. Like the principled ignorance is actually an enemy of sorts that we need to be able to overcome. And we need to find ways, I think, in both societies to create the space for people to engage with the narratives of the other while being able to really hold on to their own, to make it very clear and to make it feel safe to be able to engage with the identities and narratives of the other without feeling their own at risk. And to be honest, I think, at least on the Israeli side, that's a lot easier for what we'll call the Judean narrative than for the Zionist narrative. I think that the Zionist narrative is very much dependent on the Jews having been right and the Palestinians having been wrong this whole time. Whereas I think the Judean narrative can survive us having been wrong a couple times and there being validity to the Palestinian story. Because I think the Judean narrative, and I'll try to make clear what I mean. I'd say the Zionist narrative is the narrative of Israel's westernized ruling class, those who want to see Israel as an outpost of the West. Tel Aviv, a lot of our high-ranking generals, a lot of our journalists, a lot of our high-tech sector, what's often referred to as the Israeli left, although I don't think it would be considered much of a left outside of our borders. And I think when we talk about the Judean narrative, I'm mostly talking about the Jews in Jerusalem and the West Bank, those who are really living Jewish history in a much deeper and much fuller way. So I think, and this is maybe the irony, but it's one of the reasons why a lot of the reconciliation work that I've been involved with over the years really focuses on Jews in the West Bank and Palestinians living close by, to whatever community we're talking about. Because I think the Jews living in the West Bank, because their roots are deeper in the national story and the collective experience, and it's not just like a Jewish flavor of European nationalism. Sometimes I think that the Tel Aviv Zionist narrative or the Tel Aviv Zionist identity almost feels like a Jewish flavor of European nationalism. Whereas I think that what you find in Judea and the West Bank among the Jews is a much more ancient type of national consciousness that our ancestors shared, and much more connected to the land and to our real identity. So I think that latter Jewish narrative can actually survive and maybe even get stronger while engaging with the Palestinian story and confronting, where we might have been wrong along the way. Whereas I think the Zionist narrative often falls apart. And I think we see this quite often. We see people, the one that comes to mind is actually Miko Peled, right? Somebody who, whose father was an Israeli general and a war hero, but who was really coming from that Zionist narrative. When he confronted the Palestinian narrative, his Zionism was just destroyed. And now he's basically gone from being a one-sided kind of like pro-Israel Jew to a one-sided pro-Palestinian Jew. Whereas somebody, well, I'll use myself as the example because I'm the one. So somebody like me who is definitely coming more from the Judean narrative, living in the West Bank or East Jerusalem for the better part of the last 2 decades, and really, part of that society. Like, I'm very much entrenched. I teach in those institutions. I send my children to those institutions. Like, I'm definitely somebody who is coming from the ideological hardcore of the West Bank Jewish society. For me, at least my experience, and I think for some people like me, it was very easy to engage with the Palestinian story because I didn't feel my identity threatened. I didn't feel my narrative threatened. I just was actually, quite amazed to discover that when we take a much more authentically Jewish approach to logic and apply it to this conflict, we find much more opportunities at transcending the narrow one-sided narratives than when we apply Western logic. I think Western logic is very dualistic. Either you're right or I'm right. And when we look at our ancient sources, whether it's in the Talmud or the Kabbalistic literature, there's very rarely a situation where one person is right and the other is wrong. It's almost always, how are we all right in different ways? How are we all expressing something true in different ways? And I think that creates a lot more opportunity to build something different, to build a different approach to trying to resolve the conflict.
Have you anything to respond to that?
I mean, definitely. I don't know where to begin my response with, because there are many points. But again, how to create that narrative. That's what really interests me and matters to me, because I really think that it is key to changing the devastating reality as we speak. Because as we speak, blood is still being shed, it's still being spilled, and some critics will even question the point of having such a conversation between me and Yehuda in this panel. It is exactly that, for that reason, we have to speak, because us speaking and us having a loud voice for us to be heard, perhaps it will lead to ending that bloodshed and ending that war and ending this whole historical mess that we have created, and with the help of others as well. So no, I don't think we are weak. To the contrary, we are courageous, and we are not traitors, because at the end of the day, we are preserving our nationalistic red lines and nationalistic identity. We are not here to speak for others and speak for our nations. We are here just to address them and speak to them. Perhaps we can find some sense into them. So I will not speak about too much about the Zionist and Judean definition that you shared with us, Yehuda. But at the same time, I truly find it difficult to believe, as much as I want to believe it, but I truly find it difficult for me to believe it, that the Judeans and how you define them and describe them, and those who live in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, they're not showing any possibility of coexistence with Palestinians. To the contrary, they are at the first trenches, and they are the tip of the spear when it comes to Israeli violence, and that is bestowed upon Palestinians in the West Bank. As for Gaza, that's a different story. So let's go back to the principled ignorance. How do you think we can dismantle it? For me, for us to be able to dismantle it, for us to be able to reshape the narrative, because like you said, yeah, it is selective. So how can we make our own puzzle of selective memories that we have shared after 100 years, whereby we can have that shared narrative enough for us to have that common existence and cohabitation? I truly believe that October 7th is that shock that we needed for us to create that, and trying to find the good in the bad and some light in the darkness, because October 7th and its aftermath that is still continuing as we speak is so devastating, and it's so dark that we have to find some light in it. And for me, that light is that we have a common suffering, a common pain that was caused and created and by each other, for each other. And we have to reconcile, and we have to step up and take responsibility for our actions. And I believe that's a voice that is neither weak or traitorous, Yehuda, because as much as, like, I don't want to cry a river about our struggle as peace activists, because at the end of the day, we are only instruments or tools to facilitate a solution. We are not here to talk about ourselves. We are here to talk about peace, and peace is a painful process. And for us to reach peace, we have to really look deep down at ourselves and change how we see ourselves and how we speak to ourselves, for us to be able to change how we speak to the other and how we see it. So principled ignorance, again, I believe for us to counter it, we should use common sense. What is common sense? For me, for example, the ICC ruling against Netanyahu and Sinwar, that's common sense. And that's equality. That's not equity, not to confuse both. That is true equality, and that is something I've been calling since the beginning of the war, to have the leaders of both peoples who have led us to this catastrophic reality, to this dead end of a road between the two nations have to be held accountable and responsible in front of the international community, and that's what happened. And I was truly satisfied and content and happy and hopeful, importantly, because it gave me hope that yes, we can be equal through common sense. We shouldn't be selective and extremely selective in the way of how we interpret and elaborate and explain of our pasts and realities. We are not victims. If we are we are not victims of the other, as much as that is true, but mainly we are victims of ourselves. So we have to liberate ourselves for us to be able to be liberated from the other and the fear and the oppression that is casted on each other. So again, principal ignorance can be faced and toppled down with common sense for us to reach equality, to help us create that new narrative that we seek.
You have a rejoinder to that? You have that?
Not directly. I agree with some of what Walid said. I can't say I agree with all of it, but that's okay. I don't have to. I noticed some of the comments in the chat. Maybe I should do a better job defining, because I'm using words that other people might have different definitions for. When I say Zionist or Zionism, I'm really trying to limit that to describe a very specific movement that was created in the late 20th century to bring the Jewish people home. It was one of many Jewish liberation movements. I think the word became a very popular word amongst Jews and is often used maybe anachronistically to define movements that came before it because it was successful. I think basically from the time that the Romans destroyed our civilization until 1948, when the Jews declared a state, there had been roughly a dozen Jewish liberation movements that had attempted to restore Jewish independence to Palestine throughout the centuries. But they all failed. Zionism is the link in the chain that succeeded, and therefore we have this habit of kind of referring to all of the others as part of Zionism somehow. And I sometimes hear Jews referring to, the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks that we celebrate on Hanukkah as Zionist, or the Zealots fighting the Romans, or Rabbi Akiva. And the truth is, if we were to go back in time and ask Rabbi Akiva if he's a Zionist, he probably wouldn't know what we're talking about, even though he was fighting for Jewish liberation and Jewish independence in the land. And if we were to ask Rabbi Akiva if he was a Palestinian, he probably also wouldn't know what we're talking about. So I think there's a little bit of a habit that we both have to sometimes anachronistically use words that have very concrete and maybe sharp meanings in contemporary politics, and like apply those words to people who predate them. But I would say Zionism was a movement that is fascinating in a way, because I think that on the one hand, the Zionist leaders all self-identified as part of an ancient people from this land that had been displaced and had been struggling to come back here for thousands of years. And on the other hand, the Zionist leadership, especially Mapai, especially what we call the labor Zionists, utilized a lot of colonialist methodology in order to achieve that goal of restoring Jewish independence to the land we'd been displaced from thousands of years earlier. So we're very unique in history. I mean, I think this expresses how hard it is for people who are not us to understand us from the outside, because we don't really fit into the boxes people are used to thinking in terms of, and therefore one could look at the Zionist movement as an indigenous people's liberation movement, or one could look at the Zionist movement as a colonial project that came out of Europe. Both are partially true, meaning there are facts we can take and build with to kind of spin either story. And I think just to put what I mentioned before into practice, I think the bigger truth is both. I think the bigger truth is that, like I said, the Zionists were Jews who saw themselves as coming from this land, as having been displaced from this land and struggling to come back. I would argue that coming back to this land was the driving theme of Jewish history for almost the entire time that we were not here. But in order to do it, they used a very colonialist methodology, which explains why it's so easy for not only Palestinians, but also others looking at us from the outside to just look at it as a colonial project and apply the same kind of decolonial framework in terms of resolving the situation as one might, apply to New Zealand or Australia or Canada or the United States if this were 150 years ago. And so I think that I would actually say that this confusion about Jewish identity, there's also confusion about Palestinian identity in the other direction, but I think this confusion about Jewish identity really is really one of the core misunderstandings that drive the conflict, because I really believe that a lot of from what I've seen, a lot of the Palestinian national movement, organizations like Hamas, are employing a strategy that would be very effective if their understanding of who we are was true. Meaning if the Jews in Palestine were the French in Algeria, then using these anti-colonial tactics, kind of replicating the anti-colonial struggle of the Algerian people or of the Afghans or of the Vietnamese would work, because all you would really have to do is make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation. Meaning if all the Jews are doing in Palestine is trying to colonize and exploit, then if you were to make that too expensive, if you were to make the price, the cost of us being here, whatever the benefit of us being here is +1, we would leave. Just like the British left, right? The British say in their documents that they left Palestine because of Jewish terrorism, specifically the Lehi, the Lochamei Cherut Israel, the Stern Group, the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel. They basically applied a very Leninist framework to the struggle of the Jewish people. They said outright, we're not Zionists. We're not part of the Zionist movement. We're something else. We see ourselves as a native people fighting for its freedom. They identified British imperialist interests in the country and in the region, and they struck at those interests until it wasn't worth it for the British to stay here anymore, right? Now, the problem with Hamas employing those tactics against Israel is that ultimately they don't work. I don't want to say they don't work because we are not colonial power, because that's an argument we could have. I think what's more clearly true is that we don't think we're a colonial power. Meaning, even if we are, even if somebody wants to argue that Israel is a settler colony, at the end of the day, Israelis don't see ourselves that way. On a very, very deep level, we're convinced that this is the land of our ancestors. I live on the mountain where the Maccabim fought the Seleucid Greeks. Matityahu, who was the father of that revolt, died on my mountain. From my window, I could see where his son, Yehuda Maccabi, was killed. I spent Shabbat in Hebron a couple of weeks ago, where our ancestors are buried. I know what Hebrew tribe I come from. I come from the tribe of Levi. I know which of the 4 sub-tribes of Levi I come from. I'm a Kohen, meaning I can point to characters in the Bible who are my direct ancestors. So whether, now that might all be mythology, that might all be a fantasy, but I believe it's true. And my neighbors believe it's true. And we're willing to go to war because we believe it's true. So whether or not it's actually true is far less important than the fact that we believe it and are willing to fight for it, kill for it, and die for it. And as long as that's the reality, then I think that this Palestinian strategy of employing anti-colonial tactics to defeat Israel, defeat the Zionists, is always going to be a self-defeating strategy. It's always going to wind up with thousands of dead Palestinians.
How do you follow that, Walid?
Well, Yehuda, I agree with you. The idea of needing to face the narrative of the other is, well, first of all, it requires courage and support, at least from within, which also correlates to how we can create that narrative, is that by abandoning our traditional one and taking a step forward by knowing the other in a better way, regardless what are the motives behind ignoring the other, like you keep repeating, either knowing your enemy or finding a way for common existence. We still need to know the other. And to do that, when I did it, I was fascinated with the notion of Zionism and what it is for Jews in general. And I was at the beginning, I was very confused because to each had their own definition of Zionism. There's religious Zionism, there's post-Zionism, anti-Zionism, there's classic Zionism, there's political Zionism, and there's a conditional Zionism, which was introduced to it by the late Vivian Silver, which when it was asked for her to clarify, what do you mean by conditional Zionism? She referred to it as, she defined it as that the Jews are not free until the Palestinian people are also free. And it's fascinating to know and understand those different definitions and kinds of Zionism. And as much as it's beautiful, it also exposed or showed me that there is also a problem, that this inability to have a unified definition of what Zionism is, it also reflects how Jews see themselves and as an identity. And I started to dig deeper and try to know more and more about it. And the more I know, the more I realize that I don't know, because Judaism is a wonderful religion, just like the rest of religions, like Christianity and Islam. The religion itself, the spiritual aspect of the religion itself, and the good principles and ethics presented and forwarded by the religion itself is wonderful. And I took part in the previous Haggadah, and which was read in the Seder by some Jews, and I was proud of it because I felt that I'm making a change. I'm taking part in reminding the Jews of the essence of what Judaism is. And I was a guest in that house, and I enjoyed the hospitality, and I enjoyed taking part of that project. Now, for the Palestinian narrative and the Israeli narrative, unfortunately, since the beginning and until this moment, they continue to eliminate the other. Like, it's like, for me to exist, you have to be eliminated. And that's why I insist that after 100 years, we have created something, either good or bad, for us to share together, for us to be able to build on it. And I keep finding the catastrophe of October 7th and its aftermath that continues as the stepping stone, or as the foundation for such a shared narrative. And I truly believe that if we, for example, have a mutual shrine at the Nova Festival place where all this misery has started, for us to mourn our loved ones and to celebrate our coming bright future, once we realize that we are living together and we have to be living together in peace. It would be a nice thing to see. As for how the Palestinian narrative is problematic, well, it can be claimed that it is as problematic as the Israeli narrative, arguably maybe less, because Palestinian narrative is put in the side or in the corner of being the oppressed, being the victim. So is it effective or no? That's a different story, but I wouldn't say that there is issues regarding the Palestinian narrative. Because yes, the Palestinians have been oppressed. Yes, the Palestinians have been displaced. Yes, the Palestinians are being brutally dealt with. Yes, the Palestinian blood is still being shed right now in Gaza. But it is fixed as indigenous people who have been victimized or been done in wrongfully, and they need to be compensated in terms of their independent state according to the 242 resolution, United Nations resolution, that grants them a state within the 1967 borders of the Green Line. Unfortunately, that's not happening, or that hasn't happened, even with Oslo and the 5 years of hope and actual peace that we shared together. It collapsed with the failure of Camp David and Arafat and Barak not being able to reach a resolution. And we continued that with Omar al-Abbas, and until now, we are having this problem. So the idea is that we need to create the change from within by changing how we see things, by introducing ourselves to the other, by allowing ourselves to know the other, and it will help us know ourselves. Because to me, I just realized that Muslims and Jews are similar, as if are so similar and so different in the same at the same time. They're similar in the sense of like when I look in front of a mirror, and I raise my right hand, I see myself. Only I see the reflection in front of me showing me that as if I'm raising my left hand. So that's how similar we are. At the same time, we're so different. So there are things in common that we can dig and find. There are things that are clear and obvious, and there are things that we can also manufacture in a healthy way, the same way any narrative can be selectively manufactured. So after 100 years, and after all this bloodshed, and times of peace and truces as well, I believe that we have something in common that we can build on. The idea is to shed light on it, expose it, and introduce people to it so that it will not only be known to them, so that they will be convinced by it. Because at the end of the day, history is history, and we have blood together. So if we have blood together, and if you said, Yehuda, that being brothers in arms is what makes the Israeli society glued together and unified, then maybe us being brothers in the land will make us not just having cohabitation, but also having much more deeper than that. By being brothers in land means that we are not just one-staters or neighbors, no. We are humans, and we not just respect each other, I dare to say love each other. Because after all this hate, there has to be love at the end of the day. And I truly believe that Palestinians and Israelis can do great things together and can change the aftermath of the Second World War. And because at the end of the day, we are the catalyst failure of the Second World War, and how the superpowers were not able to close the files. So if we are able to bring peace to our societies, I think that we will be able to ease in. At least I wouldn't dare to. I would dare to dream and say that it would solve all conflicts all over the world if we solve the conflict in the Holy Land. But I believe that solving the conflict in the Holy Land would definitely ease this festered world with all these conflicts. And we have to do it by ourselves, and we need the help of others. That's why I'm here, trying to do it myself and trying to have your help to change things.
Okay, that was a lot for me to respond to. I think I am going to respond directly to some of the things you said, Walid. First of all, I agree with the late Vivian Silver about the mutual liberation. But I might disagree on what that means. I do think that at this point in time, Jewish liberation and Palestinian liberation is very much intertwined. I would argue that the Jewish people in the last 100 years, and largely through Zionism, achieved material liberation, but not psychological liberation. I think Palestinians today are in need of material liberation. And I believe that the psychological liberation of the Jewish people and the material liberation of the Palestinian people is very connected, very much intertwined at this point. I would say that a lot of the way in which Palestinians have experienced Israel, have experienced Zionism, have experienced our presence here, is definitely the result of our own colonization, of our own trauma, of how we've been impacted by thousands of years of persecution, especially Ashkenazi Jews, because we were destroyed by the Roman Empire, and it was the Ashkenazi Jews who were taken as slaves, actually from the slave markets of Hebron, and brought to Rome, and from there migrated out to places like Russia and France and Germany, and were really in the belly of the beast. We were inside of the civilization that had destroyed us. So our experience was a very traumatic one, and we haven't healed from it. Israeli society has not gone through what I think every people must go through when they achieve liberation, and that's this post-colonial conversation. We basically forced the British to leave, but then what the Zionist leadership did was take down the British flag and put a Jewish flag on a British colonial system and call it a Jewish state, instead of actually asking the fundamental questions of what a Jewish state even means. Like, what does it mean to have a nation state that expresses Jewish identity or Jewish values? What does that look like for a non-Jew in society? What does that look like for an economy? Is there such a thing as a Jewish economy? I would argue that another feature of our colonization is something you kind of mentioned in passing, or maybe inferred, that we're a religious group. You said Jews and Muslims have a lot in common. The truth is, one of the major differences between the Jews and the Muslims is that Islamic identity is a religious identity, whereas what it's meant to the Jewish people, to be part of the Jewish people for thousands of years, is shared ancestry to a very specific set of ancestors buried in Hebron. Meaning we're, an atheist Jew is no less of a Jew than I am, because he's part of this ancient people that's gone through history together. And you could say there's a spiritual worldview, there's maybe a legal constitution that the ancient Hebrews had. I would argue that, my people actually predate all these social constructs like race and religion and ethnicity and nationality. The best way to kind of define the Jews, I would say, is maybe a civilization like the Mayans, with a national component and a spiritual component and a territorial component and a legal component, but much more than the sum of those parts. And so even when we think of Jewish identity as a religious identity, I think that's also kind of reinforcing and perpetuating our colonization, just as I think a lot of the military structures and systems of control that are employed against Palestinians in the country are also expressions of our colonization. So, I'm a big fan of trying to address these problems holistically, and understanding that if we can succeed at decolonizing Jewish identity, that would also lead to liberation for the Palestinians. But I think that the only way to really decolonize Jewish identity is for the Israelis to confront what Palestinians have experienced as a result of our actions over the last century. And I just want to address something, before, when I spoke about the way in which Hamas and similar organizations try to employ this anti-colonial strategy against Israel that I claimed is doomed to failure. I'm not saying that to discredit their narrative. I'm actually saying that to critique a habit we're both guilty of superimposing narratives and identities on the other, and then crafting a strategy based on that misunderstanding of the other. I think we do it too. I think that the Israelis often tell ourselves that Palestinians fight us because they have some ideological, religious drive to kill the Jews. And you know, we hear this rhetoric a lot from Israeli leaders, and it permeates Israeli society. And I think, you know, a part of what that does, obviously, is it almost alleviates us of responsibility for anything we've done to make Palestinians feel so oppressed that they need to fight. Right? Like we, instead of us confronting or even asking ourselves the question, well, what's going on in the life of a Palestinian who's decided to pick up a knife or a bomb or a gun and attack us, instead of asking what is the pain and what is the experience and what is the sense of oppression that this Palestinian is being victimized by, we just kind of dismiss it as some, you know, Nazi-like Islamic ideology that motivates him towards violence. And so I think we're both doing this. We're both kind of superimposing these kind of simplistic identities on each other and set of motivations on each other that lead us both to very counterproductive methods of struggle. So in Hamas's case, I think it's relating to Israel as a colonial power that needs to be fought through an anti-colonial strategy. And I think with Israelis, it's seeing Palestinians as inherently driven to violence by their own ideology, and therefore the only thing we can do is try to control them. Well, either we can, you know, kill them, because then they wouldn't be here and wouldn't have the threat, but we're not willing to do that. So we have to control using all these systems of oppression that ultimately, in my opinion, drive more Palestinians towards wanting to pick up arms and come and fight us. So I think we're both employing like strategies when trying to fight the other and defeat the other that end up being counterproductive, that end up leading to results we're not truly interested in. Now, when it comes to the two-state solution, and the notion of us being brothers in the land and finding a way to be able to unite in the way that I said before, Israeli society has kind of united around the events of October 7th. Yeah, I think well, I relate to the two-state solution as an injustice that the Western powers are trying to impose on us. So for me, anyone trying to impose a two-state solution on this land is an enemy and needs to be fought. And I believe that the Jews and Palestinians here can become brothers in a shared struggle against the two-state solution. And I think that if we're willing to say to ourselves and to each other and to the rest of the world that this small land cannot be divided, that we need to figure out a way to live here together, not with walls between us, not with artificial borders between us, but actually in the land, throughout the land, together, with our different relationships. I would actually argue that Palestinians relate to this land as a parent, whereas Jews tend to relate to this land as a spouse. Just like we have very different understandings of national identity, different conceptions of national identity, I think we have different conceptions of indigeneity. I think we have different understandings of what it means to belong to the land or to possess the land or to have a connection to it. And I think that's good. I don't think that's a problem, because it actually creates a lot of space for us to share the land more easily. Meaning if Jews and Palestinians shared a national identity and shared an understanding of our connection to the land, maybe those two would be in conflict. I think a lot of Israelis, by the way, just like many Palestinians, relate to this struggle as an anti-colonial struggle. I think a lot of Israelis relate to it as a conflict between two competing nationalisms. And I think both are mistaken, because I don't think our nationalisms or our conceptions of national identity are so different that they're not actually in competition. Meaning, I envision a future, a one-state future, including Gaza, where there's a state between the river and the sea that's totally democratic. I would argue, I would hope, for a participatory democracy, not a representative democracy, but fully democratic, fully inclusive, fully equal, and simultaneously expressing in the deepest possible way both Jewish and Palestinian identity, right? So that each of us can feel like winners in our subjective narratives. Remember, like if we're living in these subjective narratives, that also means that we might experience victory subjectively, right? That we might be able to experience, there might be a way to organize this country between the river and the sea, one state, that we both can experience as a happy ending in our subjective narratives. And not only that, but be able to relate to one another as partners and not as the enemy. The big problem right now is that we see each other as the enemy. And the truth is, before October 7th, it was easier for me to talk like this. And more people were willing to hear, more Palestinians and more Israelis, and more diaspora Jews as well were willing to hear, yeah, we need to figure out a way to stop thinking of each other as the enemy. The problem is right now, for the last 7 months, we're in a situation where a lot of people's reaction to the things I say might be, well, you're wrong. They are the enemy. Whether you're talking to an Israeli or a Palestinian. Like, I think the events of the last 7 months have only reinforced this idea, reminded people why we see each other as the enemy. Therefore, I think a lot of the work that we need to do has been set back tremendously. You mentioned earlier that you think what happened on October 7th was the shock that we need. I'm afraid, even though I actually think in many ways it might have been healthy for Israeli society and healed a lot of our internal rifts, I think it's really been detrimental to being able to achieve Jewish-Palestinian reconciliation. And I just want to give a warning. I have to leave in a couple of minutes. I apologize, but certainly let Walid respond to anything you'd like to respond to that I said.
That's fine. Otherwise, what we could do is we could open it to questions from the audience, if you wish. What do you think about that, Walid?
Sure, I'm fine. Although it will be a shame to lose Yehuda early, but I think we'll have to make do. It's just that before you leave, Yehuda, please let me respond, or try to respond to some of your points. Well, yeah, in terms of the connection to the land, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or human connection to the land, it is a holy land, and this is the old land and the old world. So it will be delusional to dismiss the connection of anyone to that land and how special and unique that particular spot of this world is close to the three Abrahamic religions. So to dismiss that connection, I think that's crazy. And it's really impressive to me how someone like you, for example, Yehuda, is very familiar with the historical events that has occurred on the land. So I believe this is you showing or manifesting your connection of the land in addition to your existence on it. So I just wanted to clarify that. And I truly admire that you have recognized that it is about how that connection is being practiced and how it's leading to the suppression and oppression of the Palestinian people through a colonial methodology. And I truly also admire how you recognize the colonial paradigm whereby political Zionism has initiated or put the cornerstone for the whole process of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Again, how was that process is the problem. And until we recognize that as a problem, and recognize and hold ourselves accountable for our actions that have been done by our nations. It's not me, it's not you, Yehuda, who have done that. We haven't done that. But at the same time, we're paying the price of what my grandfather and your grandfather have done. So until we recognize those wrongdoings done by both sides, and especially if the Nakba is being taught in the Israeli curriculum, that will be a joyous day, at least for me, because that is also contributing to knowing the other and being more familiar with the narrative of the other. You also spoke of the Jewish trauma, and it's a generational one. And no matter how I try to understand it and try to unpeel it, for me to have a better look and a better understanding of it, I can't, because I am not Jewish. It is as simple as that. So I accept it as much as I accept the fear coming from it. And I try to rationalize, although that's the wrong approach, because fear is irrational. It's an irrational thing. It's an emotion, and we shouldn't address it with rationality. And the same thing with Palestinians. Palestinians also are emotional people. They are wounded and they are traumatized. So we share that trauma. And until we are able to see our traumas and recognize it and be able to emphasize, have that empathy towards each other, for us to be able eventually to hug each other and cry on the shoulders of each other for the wrongdoings that has happened to us, either by others or by each other. Because to dismiss the pain of the other and by dehumanizing the other, you can that will only result in making the other as an enemy and nothing else. And when that process is done for the other to be an enemy, it is easy to just get rid of them or squash them off. And that's what we're trying to do, to change here. I see you as a human, Yehuda, and I see the people that you represent are humans as well. That's why I try to talk to you, and I'm very happy and glad and relieved that that you are someone that I can indeed speak with. This whole colonization and how it happened and occurred, and has it stopped, or does it still continue? I believe it still continues with the continued land grabs and land annexations and settlements, or cities, as you like them to be called, Yehuda, the Jewish towns at the West Bank that are being built and expanded, whereby, yes, unfortunately, the two-state solution, although I wanted to postpone this, but yes, the two-state solution is unfortunately practically is dead. So there are different solutions to discuss, and I will address in a moment. It's just that you mentioned something about Muslims wanting to kill Jews. And as much as this rhetoric is spreading like wildfire, unfortunately, it's not true. I mean, fortunately, it's not true, because historically, Jewish golden ages and prime were witnessed during Islamic golden ages and prime, and that's in the Abbasid and the Umayyad empires. So there is an opportunity for us to recreate that as Palestinians and Israelis, and I will always believe in that possibility. And I believe in that because I also believe that the security measures will never work as a way to solve or get rid of the Palestinian question from the Israeli side. As much as I believe that the security measures coming from the Israeli side won't solve anything, I also believe that Palestinian armed struggle won't lead to anything. And it will only continue the vicious cycle of blood and violence that we are sick of as people. If you listen to Gazans, you will be surprised with how humane they are in their simple desire for a simple life, and how peaceful they are. And also you will be surprised with the surge in Gazans who believe in peace with Israelis and nothing more than that. Now, the two-state solution, I believe it's dead, especially following the 2008 negotiations and the Israeli refusal for the deconstruction or removal of the Ariel settlement, which is basically dividing the West Bank into North and South. Hence, and since the continued expansion and land grab, so basically the two-state solution is dead. Now, for me as a Palestinian, if there is a two-state solution, I will be for it. I will be for any solution that will end the occupation and provide me with the freedom that I am seeking as a Palestinian and have been demanding since World War II, which is my right to self-determine what I want to do with my life and my nation. So now, for me, I'm a one-stater. I'm not going to deny it. And because all the roads lead to, or all political solutions will lead to the one state eventually, a two-state solution, a federation, a confederation, will lead eventually to the one state because the land is tiny and it consists of 5 geographical categories or differences or types. We have the valley, we have the desert, we have the shore, we have the mountains, and we have the fertile land between Tibris, Haifa, and Jenin. So there is no room for a second state between the river and the sea. There is only a place for one state. Okay, we might be as a transitional phase, we might be leaning towards the federational solution, the federation solution, because the Jewish enclaves or the Palestinian enclaves now, we can make use of the status quo and push forward a federal plan whereby the idea of coexistence is incepted and rooted enough for us to reach that level of unification, to be living under one state. Again, this all depends on our desire for changing the status quo, because do we really want to continue killing each other? Is that what we really want? This is a question that I ask for the Palestinians and the Israelis, my people and your people, Yehuda. Do we really want to continue killing each other? I sure hope the answer would be no. Although the majority now of both societies are leaning towards the right with 70% or more of both societies. And when I say right, I mean Hamas and Baby and Smotrich and Ben Gvir and that group. So even though both of our societies are leaning towards rejecting each other and being extremist, I cannot give the fight, and we should not give up the fight in convincing both of our peoples that there is a way to live together. It is all about a choice. So does the Palestinians, do the Palestinians accept Israelis' presence on the land? Do Israelis accept Palestinian presence on the land? We have to go back to basics for us to answer the complicated questions. And for us to build that trust, it's a two-way street. We have to give, we have to send and receive, let to get, basically. Because the past or the negotiations since October 7th regarding the truce, ceasefire, and the exchange of prisoners and hostages, since October 7th, all that negotiation until this moment, to me, the way I see it is summarizing the entire history of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, only done in a very fast way and intensified way. Israelis make the offer. However, unfortunately, it doesn't appease or satisfy the minimum of what Palestinians demand at the time of the offer. And with time passing by, Israel changes the status quo and the offer diminishes. And it's still being rejected by the Palestinians because, again, it does not offer them the minimum. Just like these negotiations of this war is not giving the Palestinians the minimum by not agreeing to a full ceasefire. And I believe also part of the problem we're facing right now is that we're blinded with the war itself, is that we're only focused on the war and what's happening with the war while neglecting and ignoring, hopefully not willfully, the reasons of this war and the reasons for the conflict. Because Okay, let's say the Egyptians were able to successfully deliver us with a ceasefire deal or an exchange of prisoners and hostages. Then what? A truce for another year, 2, 5, 10 years. Then what? War and conflict is going to erupt again. That's why it baffles that nobody is talking about seizing this opportunity. Yes, it is an opportunity that is presenting itself to push and stress for a comprehensive political solution for the Israeli-Palestinian question. Because yes, the war will end. What will be following the war? The day after, who's going to be controlling Gaza? Say X or Y or Z. Then what? For how sure Netanyahu or the Israeli military or the deep state in Israel, whatever controlling force inside Israel, how sure are they that whoever a new leader or new ruler of Gaza is going to play by the book? And I don't want to dive into too many details because I do not want to quarrel or instigate one. So for me, again, it is about focusing on finding similarities and commonalities. And yes, that first thing that is obvious to me and crystal clear as something that is common is it is the loss that was casted on both of our peoples on October 7th. That pain, that loss is a shared one. So if we are able to share that pain, to share that loss, then we can share the grief for us to be able to share life together. And that will be, in my view, the best way to honor the lost ones since October 7th. And I do believe that this is not an honor for us. In fact, it is our responsibility and our duty to do that. And this is how we honor our loved ones that we have lost.
Thank you, Walid. If I may offer just a few comments before you leave, Yehuda, I'll do that. And I don't want to let you go without making sure that we properly thank you and Walid for being here today and for bringing such a thoughtful and kind-hearted approach to the conversation. And you both really have a vision for a way forward. And or at least a conviction that a way needs to be found, if not the particulars. But I will say that I think we can look at this as two separate conversations. One is the conversation about the past and the history and who's right and wrong, and even just understanding how we got to this present place. Even if we take all the judgment out of it, it's still all the past. And then there's another conversation where we get to speculate about what that coexistence can look like and what form it can take and even how to achieve it. But it's a kind of a creative conversation where we get to engage and think about the future. And sometimes it can seem tone deaf to have that conversation while all the bombs are falling and the bodies are still buried and bleeding and just the horror of the reality for so many people. But I think it's important to start planting those seeds. You know, they'll grow in their due time, but to start articulating a vision of what the coexistence can look like and just the possibility of brotherhood and sisterhood and reconciliation amongst our peoples. And you guys have really been a wonderful demonstration of what it can look like for two people to have different views and different understandings and a shared commitment to finding some way, whatever that is, whether it's one state or two states or a confederation, a federation, or who knows. But whatever it looks like, we get to at first build those human relationships and ground ourselves in that. So for that, I'm very grateful. So thank you for being here today. I think we can carry on for another 10 minutes. Maybe we'll complete with Yehuda, and then we can see if anyone has any questions from the audience for Walid. Does that sound good? Would you like to say anything before you take our leave, Yehuda?
Sorry. No, just thanks again for having me and for listening, and thank you to Walid for participating in what I think was a very thoughtful and honest discussion. We don't get to have these discussions enough, especially now. So I think it's very important when we're able to gather and do this. I really appreciate you guys organizing this and really facilitating the conversation. And I appreciate Walid for participating, really in good faith. And we have a lot of agreements and we have a lot of disagreements. But I think for the most part, we're looking in the same direction when it comes to advancing things forward. And I'd like to thank everybody who tunes in, those who've already left and those who are still here. I think it's really important that we're able to challenge ourselves and engage in different kinds of conversations than those that have typically surrounded these issues. So thanks again, everyone. If anyone has anything they'd like to follow up and talk to me about, feel free. I'm in the group chat, and Walid, it's good to see you again, and enjoy South Africa.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So now if anyone from the audience has a question, Avrio, you're welcome to raise your hand and express yourself, and we'll give Walid an opportunity to respond. So let's keep the comments to a minute or two so we can really hear from as many people as possible. All right, go ahead, Avrio.
Yeah, I'm not physically close to the area, never have been. So I would like to know if anybody could tell me like the prevailing views right now of the current conflict in Israel. The Palestinian view, I think I got. But I understand there are various factions in Israel, particularly from what I gather from my news sources, the settlers seem to be a different old faction. Can anyone comment on what's the prevailing view of what's going on with the current conflict? That's my question.
That's a broad question, Avrio. Walid, you're welcome to try to answer, or I could answer. Probably whomever answers will not be able to offer a complete one.
My answer will be simple, broad. Basically, the two camps inside Israel now are the pro-war and the pro-ceasefire. That's how I see it. And the pro-release of hostages and making a deal for their release. And those who are believe that the military operation in Rafah will lead to a decisive military victory against Hamas. And that's just a pipe dream that's being sold for the right-wingers for Bibi to continue his reign over Israel for as long as possible. That's
So
me
both of these,
and how I
so
see
both
things
these
in
points of
short.
view have substantial support. Then both those points of view.
Well, at the beginning of this meeting, I spoke with Yehuda, and I was asking him if this escalation or snowballing in the Israeli street will lead or be perceived on the same level as the escalation in the Israeli street with the Kaplan protest all over against the Netanyahu's attempt to for the judicial overhaul. And he denied it. He said that no, it will not reach that point because there is basically an external threat. And he actually thanked Hamas for unifying the Israeli society in that way. And being basically serving in the army and having different Israelis with different backgrounds serving in the army, basically being brothers in arms, will prevent such crack in the Israeli society. That is according to Yehuda. However, I believe that escalation will continue, and we will reach a boiling point where it will be a tipping point for internal Israeli politics. And I believe Gantz will leave the war cabinet, although it will mean that the entire decision will be done by Bibi and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And I believe it has to get darker before it gets brighter. It has to get darker before it gets brighter, meaning that the world and the international community, because after the Security Council decision or resolution for a ceasefire that was not implemented. And after the failed attempt for the deals and the failed negotiations and blaming Qatar for the failure, and now Egypt is in control. And now also there are voices blaming Egypt for the failure of the negotiations, which is absurd, if you ask me. However, this polarization happening in the Israeli society will reach a point whereby not just because Bibi will return to his normal government and people will go back to the Kaplan protest and something that will imitate it or be similar to it, at least in effect and impact and numbers in the Israeli society. It will also lead the international community, particularly the Americans. Okay, and I don't know if Biden will do it. Otherwise, we'll have to wait for Trump to do it, to put a leash on that government, basically, and hopefully, the ceasefire and the end of the war will be an opportunity for pushing forward a comprehensive political solution. Otherwise, we'll be chasing our tail.
And if I may just add, Walid, I think many Israelis view this as an existential matter, that having, this level of aggression and violence on its borders is intolerable. Of course, we can go into the causes of all of that. But needless to say,
may I interrupt you,
yes.
Matt? And I'm really sorry, but I
Go
have
ahead.
an urgent message for the Israeli people and for the Jewish people in general. Don't let anyone use your fear against you, either friend or foe, because this is precisely what's happening. All the actors in the region are using that fear, capitalizing on it, either for their either to unite the Israelis, either basically friend or foe. All parties are using that fear, that Jewish trauma, the Jewish fear, and they cheapen it. The way I see it is that they cheapen that fear and they cheapen that trauma behind that fear, because that trauma and that fear is legitimate, and the way it's being exploited, it cheapens it. That's why you'd find anti-Semitism growing or spreading, because people are now basically indifferent. But that's a different topic.
Indeed.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Walid. And thank you for the question, Avrio. Are there any other questions? Larry?
Yes,
Yes, I would like to respond to Avio also. I understand, Avio, that you asked the question, what does Israeli society think of what's happening now? Did I get that right?
yeah, I understand there's different
Okay,
factions,
if I got it
yeah.
right, if I got it right, then I think anybody who answers that is probably going to be wrong. And I'm going to refer to Walid, who said something very smart 40, 50 minutes ago, amongst other things that he said that are smart, and some things I agree with and some things I don't agree with. But Walid, you said you have a really tough time figuring out who Zionists are and what Zionism is and what Jews are. And well, I wanted to, because you hear so many different things. It was standard operating understanding in my parents' household, and probably in many other households, that when you have two Jews talking with each other, there are usually at least three opinions. And Avil, that's probably part of what's going on in Israel now. I would like to also reframe something that has been said in this discussion. There are those in Israel who want the war to continue, and there are those in Israel who want the hostages returned. I think that's a huge mistake in nomenclature. in calling something what it isn't. There is no one in Israel who doesn't want to see the hostages returned. That doesn't exist. So everybody wants the hostages returned. What's the dispute? The dispute is, what's the best mechanism to get there? Is the best mechanism to say, okay, you know what? October 7th was awful, but Jews, Israelis did awful things to Palestinians before that. We understand it was problematic, and continuing armed struggle is not going to help. Let's make a deal. And there are others who say, not warmongers, but others who say, we are too small a country to allow people to live on our borders who say we are going to do it again. I live 7 kilometers from Lebanon. And just last Saturday morning at 5:30 in the morning, my daughter and my grandson and I had to go into the bomb shelter. Now, luckily, we have a bomb shelter. And life is continuing mostly as standard. That certainly is not the case in Gaza. And my heart goes out to people living in Gaza, and people bleeding in Gaza, and people dying in Gaza. Does that answer your question a little bit better?
If you're addressing to me, that was very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Complete.
Larry. And we have a question from Peter. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, so this is the elephant in the room for me, and I think it's sort of now it's a prevailing point of view in America as I talk to these movements that are emerging that are anti-war and learning about what's going on. So when Matt and Larry and I were doing this project last year, we had a very close relationship and contact with a woman named Rafa. Rafa was a peacekeeper and did a lot of community work, and she was Palestinian, and it was a very important part of our ethos, right, to be collaborating with Jews and Palestinians, or Israelis and Palestinians. So when October 7th happened, she stopped working with us. But one of the main things that I heard and took away was that she said that, the Israeli government knew about October 7th. They knew. And she actually went on to say that both Matt and Larry would be just accepting the Jewish propaganda message. And so they'll never even hear the fact that it was known. And then she said directly to me too, like, you are listening to American propaganda and you'll never believe or hear what's actually going on. So I felt sort of taken back by that, and that was enough for her to not work with us anymore. And actually right now, this is a prevailing point of view with substantiated evidence around that there was plenty of intelligence and information for a long time that this was going to happen, and with 6 or 7 hours before any response is unimaginable for such an advanced intelligence agency and army. So, this is where I'm at now. I'm fully in agreement that they knew. This is like this event that gave permission for an ultimate goal for it. And I'm talking about the government. I'm not talking about Jewish people. I'm literally talking about governmental agendas, both U.S. and Israeli government. So I think that's a game changer for the public if we really can come to terms with that. And I want to put that out to the group, Walid, and really see if we can digest that, then it really shines a new light on the whole conflict.
Thank you for that, Peter. Walid, do you want to offer a response to that?
Well, before I respond to Peter, I hope there is enough time, like a minute or two, to respond to Larry. Yes, two Jews in a room, they will come with three opinions, yet fear will unite them. Fear has proven that it will unite the Jews, no matter what the differences are. And for Palestinians, unfortunately, like, I don't want to talk too much about Palestinians, but the conclusion will be is that Palestinians need to love each other for them to be able to love the other. So and love is the only thing that will counter fear. Other than that, we'll continue to find problems for us to just fight over and like bones to pick with each other. Because it is not a religious fight. It is not, maybe perhaps it has started as colonial struggle or colonial fight, but it has changed in the transition. Into what will it produce at the end? I believe that it is up to us, Palestinians and Israelis, to decide that. And again, are we going to continue killing each other? Are we going to annihilate each other? Because we're not going to be able to. And and unfortunately, such rhetoric still exists inside Israel. The idea of eliminating Hamas, the idea of eliminating Palestinians, the idea of kicking Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank. And as long as we will adopt that as a group, we are doomed. Because again, there is no Jewish liberation without the Palestinian liberation. And until we realize that as a group, first as individuals, because that's how you break groups and create it, by individuals. So we have to work on individuals one by one. It's a painful process, one that is very long and requires extreme patience, and you might not live to see its fruits. However, we keep planting the soil and farming the land and taking care of our business by promoting our message and by making our voice heard. Again, I don't think that Yehuda speaks for the Israelis. I definitely do not speak for Palestinians. However, we definitely speak to them. We want them to listen to us. We want them to hear us. And after all this unprecedented violence and hate and warmongering that's happening in both of our societies, again, I'm trying to find the good in the bad, the yin and the yang, to be able to find, by being hopeful and remaining hopeful, to find a solution forward, a way forward. And I try to come up with theories. I try to connect the dots. And at the end of the day, I also need my Israeli brethren, my Israeli peace partners, along with my Palestinian peace partners, to keep pushing forward. The camp is small. And since the war, we are literally burnt out. And we need the support, the mental one, the emotional one, the physical and material one as well. Because again, being a peace activists as Israelis or Palestinians means that we're going to be casted away, casted out, and outcasts. We're going to be delegitimized and pointed at either as weak or collaborators. So we are strong enough to keep on fighting this uphill fight. It's not an uphill fight, it's an up mountain fight. Because this is a great mountain that we are climbing, and step by step, slowly, sometimes we need to take our rests, and that's fine as long as we keep on pushing forward. As for another point that I wanted to respond to Larry with, it's about how the Israeli society in all its diversity and its camps is not disputing its desire of the return of the hostages. They differ only in how to return them. And again, as I have been saying over and over, and I will continue to say, no brute military force, no security measure will lead to a solution. There has to be a political one. And because again, it has been proven over and over. And please tell me, how many hostages was Israel able to release using brute force? And how many hostages were released in the first deal? I'm not good at math, but I can assure you that the Israelis who have returned home after that deal were much bigger of a number than the Israelis who have returned home following a militarized operation. So
Well,
until
yeah,
the Israeli society realizes that.
I'd like to respond to
Yes.
that. Just ask a question. I'd like to respond to that. Do
Yes,
you
go
have,
ahead.
do you have inside knowledge
Yes.
that can tell you that the release of hostages in negotiations was not pressured by military presence? Do you have inside knowledge to that?
I have my own analysis. I do not
Okay.
have.
I have my analysis, you have your analysis.
That's true.
We
Yes,
disagree.
absolutely. Well, for me to negate your analysis and prove it wrong, basically, is that if that conclusion is true and that the first deal was done by brute force or reached out by brute force, then how come we didn't reach a second deal after all what has been done to Gaza? How long? Since November? When was the deal?
The answer is because
Yes.
Sinwar doesn't get anything for it. He
Well,
was hoping that at the end of the first deal, there would be a withdrawal of forces. That didn't happen. Israel did not agree to do that. Now he is convinced that no deal is better than a deal because Israel will never agree. By the way, I think it will eventually. He thinks, will not agree to a ceasefire to get the hostages back. But neither you nor I can see inside Sinwar's mind. So you can have your analysis.
nor Netanyahu's mind.
Neither,
You know?
I agree.
Although it's easy to predict Netanyahu than Sinwar.
A little bit easier because he makes many more public statements. Yes, you're right.
Well, again, as I keep saying, what do you expect from Palestinians, regardless, blue, white, red, black, regardless which political faction, regardless Palestinian in general, when you keep pushing them, when you take away any other options from them, you make them
Agreed.
dangerous.
Agreed.
So what do you expect? What do you expect from Hamas or Sinwar when you keep saying that you want to eliminate
That's true
them?
for everybody. I'm not arguing that point. I'm saying that is a point.
Mhm.
That can't be dismissed. People find it very hard to live with a gun, with a sword in the air over their head. Both Palestinians and Israelis. But let's not ignore either side that is living in that fear. Because people in both camps say, I'm gonna fuck you.
Well, yes, to each side have their own reasons and own motivations to hate on the other and practice that violence. That's why we try to eliminate those components that add to the fire or add fuel to the fire. That's why we try to bring together. That's why we try to. Yes, Ben.
I wonder if I might just add a little bit here. I think we're getting into a kind of an argument or discussion, and I think probably it's a good place to bring this meeting to an end, because it could well be that some of it may be the start of another conversation. You agree?
Well, but then allow me to reiterate what I have said already earlier in this session, is that yes, Israelis make offers. yeah, unfortunately, they never meet the minimum demands of the Palestinians at the time of that offer. Larry, the idea of having Israeli troops inside the Gaza Strip, I think that's something that can be negotiated within the greater framework of a comprehensive political solution. Again, what is the issue here is that Israel is refusing the full ceasefire. Instead, it insists on truce. Again, that is the minimum demand of Palestinians this time, a full ceasefire.
Walid, what do you think would happen if all of a sudden, without any connections to anything else, all the hostages were released? What do you think would happen?
I think it would have the same impact if Sinwar decided all of a sudden with a statement that he wants to address the Knesset, similarly to how Sadat did in the 70s.
Yeah, it would work. It would work very quickly.
That's why, and here you might be surprised when you hear me say this, is that Israel and Hamas are two sides of the same coin when it comes to counter the Palestinian national movement and Palestinian goals for a nationhood. Because Hamas has its own ideology, its own agenda, its own connections, and it keeps bouncing on and off between what is Palestinian and what is Islamic to serve its own agenda. And let's not forget they are a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, you're
And
doing a great job. Keep it up.
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Larry. The words mean a lot to me. So we try to voice a more reasonable and rational Palestinian voice to be presented, that yes, there are Palestinians out there who deserve to live, who are speaking for their people who also deserve to live, because everybody deserves to live. How to live, that's what we're trying to change, because Israelis cannot continue living with Palestinians next to them being oppressed and under military occupation. This cannot continue. This should not continue. And our future together, I mean, truly, again, like I said, I truly believe that we can have an impact on an international level, not just a regional one. If we reach a point of realizing and understanding that our future is a mutual one.
Maybe our job, we here, this group, is to start listing the baby steps for each society that could help understand, that could help the other guys understand.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And there are things that are already ready. It's just that
Send them
it's
to
all
me.
about the timing. I'm
Send
sure.
them.
I sure will. I
Well,
will.
Well, we're starting to run short on time.
Yes.
So I would like to wrap this up, but this has been really a very rich conversation on we covered a lot of ground today on some really substantive issues and kind of big picture framework ways of looking at the conflict, which I think are quite valuable to have that framework rather than just sort of a day's headlines perspective on events. So I think that this conversation has been a real contribution. Bill, I want to thank you for being our facilitator today and through the series, and for helping us with all the preparation to get this set up. And to you, Walid, and I'll include Yehuda in my remarks as well. Thank you both for being here today, and we're really grateful. Sometimes I say you need to be a partner to have a partner. And I think you both have shown your willingness to be a partner, and inshallah, you get to have a partner at the same time. So, so yes, this is a very complex conflict, and I think there's a reason why it's been intractable for so many decades. And I think we're doomed, like you said, if we dedicate our efforts only trying to overpower one another, we're doomed. So, and of course, there's a lot of opinions, and the stories and even facts to support our stories. But at the end of the day, we have to find a way to coexist. And in the year 2024, I believe that that's really possible. You know, we're in some ways primitive, but in other ways advanced, and we get to create the future together. So, so with your help and with everyone's help, we can really do that. So I'll say just a couple of words about the Middle East Peace Civic Forum. I invite everyone to go check out our theory of change and sign up for our newsletter and learn more about upcoming events on our website, www.mepcf.org or middleeastpeacecivicforum.org. And we welcome you to reach out to us and be in communication. For everyone watching the recording later, please reach out to us and be in communication with us. We'd love to hear from you and work with you. And of course, the Middle East Peace Civic Forum is counting on donations from supporters who really are willing to give generously and who believe in the value and power of these kind of conversations, and our quest to find a better way and live together and share this beautiful land, you know, from river to sea. Everyone gets to live, and there's enough room for everyone. And go ahead,
Everyone
Walid.
will be free from the river
Everyone.
to the sea. Everyone will be free.
Yes. So that's the vision, and we invite you to join us and come check out our next programs. These meetings are going to be on the fourth Thursday of every month. So you can mark your calendar or let us know, and we'll drop you into our calendar as an invitee of these conversations. So with that, again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Walid, Bill, and of course, Yehuda, and to our audience and team. Thank you.
Thank you.